Okay. So we talked about two different things last time, and I'm not so sure how they relate. One is we talked about the distinction between spirit and matter, mind and body. That was one thing. We've talked about this a lot now, so I'm not even going to review it. And then we also talked about language. That is, we looked to John Donne, and we saw that he was using similar terms. He's thinking about the relationship between, I think, between mind and body, or probably mind and body, or soul and body, or whatever. He's not doing it necessarily in the explicit terms that we spoke about at the first part of last class. He's really focusing on these two passages on language. And because I really spent a long time this week trying to figure out these passages, so I thought maybe we just go over them again, and maybe I can give you a little bit of what I think Donne is doing here. I mean, I'd love to hear your responses as well. I mean, we talked last time, these two things, we won't read them carefully, but he calls God in this first passage, if you remember, a figurative, a metaphorical God, and we wanted to understand what that meant. He goes on and says, well, God expresses himself in heights of figures, voyages, precious metaphors, extensions, curtains of allegories, heavens of hyperboles, harmonious elocutions. It seems that Donne here is talking about divine revelation, and that the divine revelation through language does all of these things. I mean, as Ed emphasized last time, and I wonder when we think of revelation, what is revelation of the divine? How do we think of revelation of the divine? Is revelation of the divine something spiritual or mystical? Is it, I mean, if we're living in the 19th century, I think we would much more tend to think of the divine as the experience of the sublime, maybe the thing that can't be expressed in language. But there's also the perspective, and I think that's Donne's here. It's also pretty normative in Western religious cultures. Revelation here, at least in part, is through language. Really, in the Jewish and Christian traditions, I don't know enough about Islam, but in the Jewish and Christian traditions, it's not uncommon to think of revelation as being the revelation through language, through the word, and the revelation through the world. I mean, I assume people are familiar with this notion from their own liturgical frameworks, or whatever. It's not an uncommon notion that God reveals himself in two ways. Through language, through the nature, and maybe that experience of the awesomeness of the divine, knowledge of the divine, but then this other kind of revelation, which is through language. Obviously, let's say in the Hebraic tradition, out of the Jewish tradition, whatever, language is privileged, right? I know there's a rabbinic, I don't know if it's Kabbalistic or rabbinic, that God created the world there were 10 ma'amarim before the 10 commandments. The 10 ma'amarim are, I don't know, whatever they are, the things that God says, and they correspond to God's creation of the world. So even the natural world is constructed through language in the Jewish tradition, which is interesting, right? But there are those two sides of revelation, one emphasizing more the linguistic, one emphasizing more the natural. And Donne here is coming in that tradition, obviously, of seeing revelation through metaphor. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? And then he says over here, only, oh, what words but thine can express the inexpressible texture and composition of thy word. I think, as we said last time, the literal meaning of this here is God's own words have a certain kind of priority, and through them we're unable to understand the divine. I mean, Donne is really asking questions, and no matter what I think our theological backgrounds or commitments, I think it's very rare that people take a step back and think about, well, what is the nature of revelation? What does that actually involve? What's entailed in revelation? I mean, it's obviously this belief or faith that, and there's the faith in the divine. That's step one, and step two is the faith in the divine, that the divine can actually reveal himself. And I'm using he as, I realize that all of the names of God are just metaphors. They're just metaphors. It's a way of God expressing himself in the world. Sometimes they're masculine, mostly masculine. Sometimes they're feminine, Shechina, right? So what does it mean when God expresses himself through revelation. We realize that, starting in the 18th century, there's more and more of an idea of, we can say God created the world, but that God actually is involved in the world, that he reveals himself. I mean, I guess revelation still stays for a long time, even in religions that become, let's say, more and more skeptical and more rational, where there will be the questioning of God's providential involvement in the world. That metaphor of God as a clockmaker. God makes the clock, winds it up, sets it, and just leaves it aside, and it operates according to certain kinds of physical laws, but God's really not involved in that world. I mean, so there are all sorts of assumptions. I think part of the reason that some parts of the intellectual world are so skeptical about religion and God is because the languages that are used to describe religion and God are themselves so decadent, really. And the decadence of the spiritual world, wherever you encounter it, think about in America right now, let's say right-wing evangelicals, the decadence of that spiritual world lends itself it lends itself to skepticism. Meaning, why believe in something which seems to be so simplistic? And I think one part of the reason I'm going on like this, just a second, take one reason I'm just going on like this is that I think we underestimate just the complexity of what's entailed in idea of faith or belief, and also what's entailed by divine, what's entailed by the idea of revelation, what's entailed by the idea of God making himself present in the world. None of these, we're getting a musical background. None of these are necessarily simple. And I just think the more we allow for the complexity of theology without saying afterwards, oh, now I'm going to believe in God. Right? That's not the point. The point is to understand what goes into this, what informs these beliefs. I'm sorry, Tiffany, did you have a comment?
Question, actually.
Yes.
When you say the decadence of the spiritual, what kind of, just having thankfully not had a lot of experience with evangelical Christians.
Or decadence, for that matter, right, Tikva?
I don't know. Right? I have a roof over my head. I have food to eat. I have clean water.
No, so decadence. Decadence. I mean, I used it as a shorthand, and I meant a kind of decadence in terms of indulgence and self-interest. So, you can think of any kind of corrupt religious leaders. People in the Israeli community here. People who decadent means not taking their responsibility as teachers seriously.
Oh, okay. So right? Indulgent.
Yeah, or self-interested.
Okay.
So here, going back to Donne, we've talked about the way in which so what are these words? God, so what, and what does it mean for God to represent himself through words or language? What does that mean? I think this week after reading Donne, and please interrupt me, I know I'm kind of freewheeling here a little bit, so please interrupt me. While I was reading Donne, I started to get a kind of intuitive sense of what I think Kabbalah is. I know a little bit about Kabbalah, but not a lot, but it deals with a lot of the issues I see now. It makes much more sense to me. It really deals with the issue of how does the divine represent itself? How does something that's infinite represent itself in the world? Right? And that's really what Donne is asking. How does something that's infinite represent itself in the world? And the surprise is for Donne, he does it, and not the surprise for Donne, but the surprise for us, is he does it through metaphor. So God's revelation, that's how Donne looks at it. So God, in a way, and here, this is the formulation I came up with, so I would like your response to it. It's kind of what I've been thinking about this week, is that God, as it were, knows himself and reads himself, and through that reading represents himself. Now, the issue here is that God, the agent of knowing, well, that's divine, but more problematically, the thing that is known is divine. How do you know something that's divine? How does God read himself, as it were, such that he can provide an understanding that will be suitable whatever that would mean, to be represented to humanity. Really, the question is, in another way, how does the infinite translate himself into finitude? You hear that question? How does the infinite, right, how does God make himself present? And I think that's a theological question that probably a lot of theologians address. But Donne says here that God does that through metaphor.
Right. Well,
and he uses the verb I think he uses here is, I think he says either translate or transport. Let's see. Sorry.
I think the inverse of it is just as difficult. It's like, how do we as finite beings understand the infinite, or can conceive of
Okay, right. And if you're going back to our Miltonist, those were the two discussions we had when we were reading Milton. One was, how does God make himself present? Is that possible? Or how does the poet do it, right? And I think in this, you'll see that I'm looking at the poet, or God as a model for the poet in a way. But when we were reading Milton, going back to Milton, the question was, A, how does the poet represent what he has to say? He's a prophet, or kind of like a prophet, Milton claims. And then the other side, as you were saying, well, once that act of communication has taken place, well, what guarantees that it actually goes back up in the other direction? And Milton is worried about both of those things. He has anxiety about writing. He's never sure about representing invisible things to mortal sight. And he has anxiety about his readers, right? His fit audience, though few, gets smaller and smaller. Both of those things address that issue. But I think for Donne is looking at this act of, this is the way I'm translating it, that God through knowing himself represents himself through metaphor. And metaphor is the way in which the divine becomes present in the world. And the poet does the same thing as God does. The poet takes what she experiences as infinite, think of Milton, right? And makes it finite, renders it, makes it present in language. And so there's that parallel moment. That's why I think when you look back at Philip Sidney and others who talk about about human creativity as Tselem Elohim is creativity. How does man imitate God? He imitates God by being a creator. Different people say that in different traditions. Sir Philip Sidney, the Nefesh Chaim in the Jewish tradition, kind of, sort of, right?
May I, about the metaphor?
Please.
I think that one of the, if we're talking about how God talks about himself through revelation, I think it's one of the powers of metaphor is that it can be interpreted in multiple ways. And one of the things that you see in the Tanakh is that there are many, many, many metaphors used to describe God and to describe a person's relationship to God. And
well, that's what Donne is talking about, right? When he talks
right. So there's this multiplicity of perspectives, and also when you say how can the finite perceive of the infinite, I think it's worth pointing out that there is a correlation between insanity and prophecy, and I do not think that and part of that is that the human mind cannot really handle revelation.
Okay, I mean, there are certainly. I mean, I was going to ask you when you were talking about prophets. I don't mean somebody who's running around King George drooling with a 35-year-old sitter in their hand. I mean, right. I'm sorry for that characterization. Fine, but it's not necessarily prophecy is associated with rationality as well, right? But okay.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's just go back to Donne, because I want to. We're now discussing. So what does language then do for Donne? So here's the end of the last passage. First, he talks about the riddle, and that resonates a lot for me, especially since we were reading, and maybe for you as well, those of us who read Samson together, and we talked about the way in which he really is a riddle. That's one of the reasons people focus on that story, why it elicits so many midrashim, because he's a riddle in the center of that story. He's kind of the unknowable, which nonetheless needs to be represented. So here, Donne talks about the infinite as, where he talks about this riddle. That's the seeing through. That's seeing through. What's the verse that he's working on it from Corinthians? Now we see through it. Now we see through a glass darkly, then face to face.
Then face to face.
Yes, right. So here he says, let's just go. Yeah, Chafin, let's just go through this first.
I think that's referencing Moses. I'm just like that Moses. God talks about revelation to Moses and says that revelation is through riddles, and through these distorted images, and that is the nature of revelation.
Okay. I would like to see that at some point. Yeah.
Can I just pick up on what Poetic was saying? Because it seems that Donne is very interested in language, and as a Protestant, it seems our discussion is leading us in this direction. There's something very Hebraic about the way he approaches the idea, what Tiffany just said, the connection between Moses and St. Paul. But there's no, in Catholicism, God incarnate. I mean, what we're not really dealing with here is Jesus was the infinite became finite within the body of a man in Christianity.
Exactly. Right.
And within Catholicism, language becomes less important as a result.
Well, that's interesting.
And image and other more material, and really iconography. So and the Protestant rejection of that brings them back in line with the sort of Hebraic idea of idolatry and the primacy of language.
Right, that's very interesting. And just going back to, I'm still a little bit confused by what you're both saying about Mosaic riddles, though I know that, because I was focusing on the face-to-face, which of course from Corinthians is an appropriation of Exodus, right? Moses sees face-to-face. In the rabbinic tradition itself, that face-to-face is understood through language. Rashi provides the Aramaic translation of it, which is in English, words to words, that the rabbinic tradition is unapologetic about the relationship to the divine being expressed through language. It's kind of pushing, right? Do you hear what I'm saying? That the rabbinic tradition is unembarrassed, right? Face-to-face sounds like, well, that's great. Let's have a face-to-face. Let's have that unmediated relationship. And the rabbis push off from that. They don't believe in that. There is no, that's why I'm always, certain mystical trends in Judaism that work against this, or working against that rabbinic idea that the divine is accessible through language. Spinoza, who went to Cheder, right? He went to a Jewish day school. He writes about the face-to-face, and he says explicitly, he knows this Rashi, he says explicitly, for Moses, the revelation was words to words, but for Jesus, the revelation was mind to mind, right? It's not even, it's a kind of spiritual, intellectual revelation, which is seen from certain philosophical and Christian traditions as being far superior. That's better, right? It's better to move off of language, because one of the things that Spinoza does is he turns the stories of Tanakh into just stories. They're just stories for him. He says these things happen at certain times in certain places, and therefore they're of limited use. They're not universal. He's taking everything he's taking the infinite out of history, really. He takes the infinite out of history and out of language, and he turns it into spirit and intellect. How do you realize yourself as a spiritual being? Through knowledge, through knowing. How do you do that? You do that exclusively with your, whatever, I don't know enough about Spinoza, but you do it intellectually, not in relationship to language. But Donne here, let's just go back to Donne. Donne says, how does God express himself? This enigma is spoken of now. This dark similitude in comparison is proposed to our faith. And so far we know God, that is, believe in God, is this life but by enigmas, by dark representations and illusions. Now, on the one hand, we can say, oh, right, that's what religious people do. They're interested in enigmas, dark representations, and illusions. Who cares? But from Donne's perspective, it's not only, the human not only expresses itself through these dark enigmas, but the divine himself expresses himself through these enigmas and representations and illusions. But maybe I missed a step here, because I think Donne here, and maybe I would be interested in what you would say. I think Donne here is interested in licensing the kind of writing that he does. He also writes through enigmas, representations, and illusions. And he does that not because it's cool and impressive, but he does it because that's all that's possible. What I meant by not by cool and impressive, meaning Donne is not showing off his cleverness by saying, you know, enigmas, dark representations, and illusions. He's accommodating a reality which can only be expressed in that manner. Because after all, that's what God did. So can I ask you now, before we move on to Newton and Leibniz, what does language do? We ended with this last time. Ed, you and I were supposed to meet this week to discuss this. We never did that. So what's been on your mind?
Lots of things, but I go around in circles, to be honest. But on this, what you're saying about Donne is very interesting, because he seems to, as you said, get to religion at the end of his life through poetry. So a lot of these techniques are there at the beginning when he's talking about more profane matters. And he continues his poetic style even when he transfers into religion. So I like that idea of self-justification.
So that's interesting. So you say the consistency of Donne throughout his career is that he's a poet throughout his career, but he's just dealing with different subjects.
Yeah.
That's a cool insight, right? I mean, we've been talking a lot about how for poets, poetry is an activity. And Ed is basically saying that that same activity that Donne involves himself in when writing love poetry is the activity that he involves himself in writing about God. He's being a poet in both cases. Does that make sense, Ed?
Yeah, and the core, whether he gets led by himself in the direction of God, or whether it's just the different concerns of a man who's growing old, I don't know, but there is a consistency.
I would point out that you're quite a young man still. You know, you're the Lear of the late comedies, you're the Shakespeare of the late comedies, not of King Lear. Act your age. Act appropriately happy. Yeah. Okay.
I put the passage from Corinthians and the passage from Numbers in the chat.
Pardon? You'd put them together in what?
I put the passage from Numbers and the passage from Corinthians are both in the chat.
Oh, okay, good. Great. Thank you. Okay. So, yeah, so Ed, did you finish answering my question, what does language do? You know, it's starting with Hobbes is, I think, the modern view of what language does, which is, Hobbes is the first nominalist, meaning he has this idea that the relationship between a word and a thing is completely arbitrary and conventional. There's no relationship between the word and the thing. They're signed systems. I think I don't know, intuitively that's what makes sense to me as well. Language is just a set of conventions, and we connect things through those conventions. But you see here, there are other ideas of what language is and does, right? Is Donne's idea of language holy? Is it sacred? Yeah, Alana.
Well, I think there are I think there's such a thing as an experience. When you experience something, you don't necessarily have the words to convey that experience, especially if it's a religious experience, if it's love, if it's one of those very strong traumas, well, and it's very difficult to convey an experience to another person. And I think that's what writers do. I think that's what poets do. And I think they do it using metaphor because it's the only way that you can really describe or convey an experience. Because what I want to do is not that you understand intellectually what my experience was. I want to convey that experience to you. I want you
okay,
to...
so following up on that, what happens in that moment of understanding? I mean, I was just thinking, right? Alana just said something, and I was kind of going along with it because I didn't understand what her point would be. And then, boom, she said something, and I was like, oh, right? That came with like the force to me of, I'm thinking of it as a metaphor. It was like a revelation. Now
Right.
I understand. What happens at that moment?
Even more so, I want to say, you know, I teach some workshops in writing, and I often tell my students, I say, don't even try to make up metaphors, just try to convey the experience, because I think our minds are hardwired to think in metaphors, and that's why they work so well. And they're going to come to you if you sincerely try to convey an experience. You'll find that you're going to be talking in metaphors. You're going to find that that's how you're going to express yourself, because that's the way we think.
But my next step, though, is why would I have faith that the metaphor that you're using is adequate to the experience? I'm just trying, again, and I'm focusing on that moment of understanding. It's almost, I do think there's this kind of sacred aspect to understanding in poetry, especially. That is, you're showing your faith in me by saying, here, and in yourself first, I can explain this. I'm going to explain this. You show that faith in me. And then I show that faith in you that you have something to say that is understandable, and then I can understand it. I mean, am I being too like prosaic about or too philosophical about what happens in this moment of understanding? But I think since there's so much misunderstanding, it's useful to think about what goes into the ingredients of that moment of understanding. And it is what, Alana, you're talking about, right? What poets do. And I'm just generalizing it, you know, to going back to what you were saying to me. Yeah, Bara, do you want to say something? You're muted. Unmute, yeah.
No. Your microphone isn't working.
Your microphone isn't working, Bara. We don't hear you yet. So when you address that issue, get back to us.
Can I just make a suggestion that relates back to what I said about the French and shorthand last time? About Renaissance.
We're revisiting that?
We're revisiting that. And the way that Renaissance English itself lends itself to where Donne gets, where you essentially have two languages overlaid on top of each other. So where Hobbes may think that one word means one thing, the English is, especially in this period, is fairly unique in that there's a huge range of words for exactly the same thing. And in this passage, and I always do this for Shakespeare, if you look at the Anglo-Saxon and then you look at the Latinate words, you suddenly see a pattern. So here you have dark, faith, God, life, dark.
That's Anglo-Saxon?
Those are all Anglo-Saxon. And then,
right.
And then all the qualifying metaphorical things are similitude, comparison, proposed, belief,
representation
and illusion.
Right.
And that's what I meant about English having that. It's almost inbuilt into late Elizabethan Jacobean English to have this struggle within the language.
What do you mean? So the struggle within the language means that it's unstable and it can't be what Hobbes claims it is.
Right. Which word do I use? And then how do those words relate between the two traditions? I mean, the dark similitude is a just a great example where it's inherent within the language.
So what does language do? Does it summon a meaning? What does it do? I mean, I keep on thinking of Shakespeare at the end of "As You Like It, I Conjure You." You know this, and there is something really magical about Shakespeare. Ed's writing a lot about this, as opposed to other writers of the period. The magic of Shakespeare. What I'm just looking, or what is metaphor? I mean, the way I guess we're reading metaphor just seems almost to perform this kind of. I guess if you think understanding is a sacred act, then metaphor is kind of a sacred thing. I mean, maybe that's my assumption that there's something, or for me, going back to what Alana said, there's this moment of almost revelation, right, of understanding. So understanding for me, I realize I'm using theological terms to describe it, and if you use those theological terms to describe it, well, then metaphor does seem like a kind of sacred act, meaning, or part of that sacred act, or that faith. I'm just wondering, does language pull something out of reality? Does it make reality? Does it create reality? Does it invent reality? Does it discover reality?
It changes how we perceive it, reality. I mean, there's, that's why we police language and we change language, because it changes how we think. When we change our language from, if you'll excuse me, if you change the term from retarded to mentally, I don't actually know for mentally challenged,
disability, whatever, yeah.
Or disability or whatever, like that's different. And when you say, mentally ill instead of insane, that changes how you perceive the person. So and there's an excellent passage about this in 1948, about how if they create this new language called Newspeak, eventually people won't be able to commit thought crime.
1984. You're such an Israeli too. Yeah. 1984, not 1948. But yeah, right.
Yeah, there's this bit about how there's this linguist talking about how they're creating this kind of new shorthand language almost, and in the end you won't be able to commit thought crime because you won't be able to have the words, the concepts with which to think wrong thoughts.
The ultimate fascism, right? And so there's also a passage in Shakespeare: "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet," right? By any other word would smell as sweet. True or false? And Tikva's just given us a lesson in why that's not true, right? Juliet says a rose by any other name word would smell as sweet. And I mean, of course, the irony after she says that is she calls out to Romeo, and she talks about how language doesn't make a difference. It's not necessary. They can have their transcendent love outside of the social, outside of language. And then she calls out because she hears the noise beneath the balcony. She calls out who's there, which inevitably invites the response, Romeo, meaning he's forced, even as she expresses her idealism about a world without language, that for them it would be, she has to default back to language. So language creates the world?
Well, it shapes, I wouldn't say the world, but it certainly shapes.
It shapes our perceptions, right? I understand that. I'm just wondering.
Right. No, but I'm saying our cultures as well.
But does it go back to this idea? I mean, maybe I think what happens in, Donne says over here, right? He says, just go through it, right? And for such, we'll do it quickly. And for such a sight of God as we take the apostle to intend here, which is to see that there is a God, the frame of nature, the whole is our theater, the book of creatures is our medium, our glass, and natural reason is light enough. So through sight, you can understand that there is a God. All these innovations in the way of seeing are starting to happen. Newton doesn't write the optics till much later, and I don't know a lot about this, but Kepler is writing about optics much earlier. So people are thinking a lot in terms of sight. So Donne says, if you want a knowledge of God, well, if you see God, and it's complicated what he means by seeing it, the world is a theater, creatures are the medium, so somehow we see the reflection of God, but we see him and we know from that reflection that there is a God. But then he goes on, and yet while we are in this world, it is but an enigma and the obscure riddle or representation darkly, and in part there's that word, and as we translate it, certainly knows that the Greek for that is metaphor, right? As the glass which we spoke of before is proposed to the sense, and so we might see God, that is, see that there is a God. this enigma that is spoken of now, this dark similitude of comparison is proposed to our faith. And so far we know God, that is, believe in God in this life, is but by enigmas, by dark representations and illusions. So he's making a distinction between knowing that there is God and experiencing God. Knowing that there is God, you can do with sight. But experiencing God, is that the distinction that he makes?
I think he's distinguishing between knowing there is a God and understanding what God is.
I mean, I think that's what was my shorthand for knowledge and experience. And the experience is coming through language, right? So that's what keeps on getting me, right? Because language is what is the relationship of this material thing called experience or language? But I mean material, it's physical, it's what we do. What is it, or produce? What is the relationship between that artifact, that made thing, that language, and the divine that it tries to represent? See, I'm coming back to the same question, the physical and the spiritual, right? And I'm trying to ask that question in relationship to language. Maybe it's the wrong question to be asking. Ed, do you want to translate a little bit of what or respond to this a little bit so we can make sure it's clear to everybody?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm a bit distracted. I was thinking about something, but yeah, I was thinking about something that happens earlier in Shakespeare in Measure for Measure, where there's a passage where I've read it, a few hundred times, and it really doesn't make any sense, actually, at all. And yet it gives you a profound impression that there is a divine layer behind the words, and you get a very strong sense of meaning, and it's intentionally given to the very pious Isabella. And it is exactly on this issue of theatra mundi, the theatre of the world, what you see, and what lies behind the experience of. But
isn't Isabella such a kind of, bad, she's like a cliche, right? I mean, she's a cliche, and why would she get the words to express the divine? Isabella, as you remember from the play, she's the very, very holy nun. When I abhor it, I cannot say the word, I abhor it, right? I mean, Shakespeare's doing the most simple kind of Freudian game with her, right? At the moment that she wants to reject whoredom, she can't help but say whore. So that's why I'm asking Ed, why would she get the good lines about spirituality?
I completely agree that it's out of character, and she's a very simplistic character, but nonetheless, maybe Shakespeare is saying that we're misreading her. Maybe she is a deeper character than we think she is.
That's interesting.
Because I really like Isabella.
Okay.
I think she's the only person in the play who sticks to her convictions. She's
a little bit.
Piety does not change.
A little bit. Well, and her piety. She's. That could be a good thing, or it could be
consistent.
The dogmatism of her piety, right? So much so she's so dogmatic about her piety that she can't help saying things that she doesn't really mean. Where actually she really does mean them, she just doesn't know that she means them, right?
Right. Well, I mean, in comparison to Angelo, who just,
right. But so right.
falters.
Right. So, but language. So, what does that mean that there's something behind the language? I'm trying to get behind the metaphor of how we think about what language does.
The experience. The only other thing I associated is, in the poetic tradition, is someone like T.S. Eliot saying, doesn't matter if you can understand medieval Italian, just read, the Inferno out loud and you'll get a sense of God. And there is this idea that the experience of language can be transported. I'm not quite sure how we, nail that down to specific.
Right, it's a way, I think it's a false, I'm kind of looking for an essentialism in regard to the thing which is non-essential. Meaning, what's the definitive metaphor for language? A stupid question in a way. Because language itself, we're saying, by virtue of its, what Tikva was talking about before, its multiplicity, its inclusiveness. I guess what you're suggesting also about the English language, the way it combines itself, that there are just always new possibilities of meaning. There's always new, and I guess, and that transcends any one definition of what language does. But you can see why alchemy was such a live thing for people like Newton, and for Donne especially, alchemy is all over his work, because for him, poetry is alchemy. That's the best I could do this week. What is alchemy? It's finding something that's there and activating it. It's seeing the gold that's inside of the lead and turning the lead into gold. The lead doesn't know it has gold in it, but if you look at it with the right lens, and that's what Newton tried to do in his laboratory, if you do the right experiments, you'll take out the gold. Are you inventing it? No, it's there. But the alchemical act, and this is a great metaphor for poetry. The alchemical act takes that physical thing and finds what's transcendent in it. And in a way, understanding, as Ilana put it before, is also alchemical. Meaning I'm taking you're taking the something from nothing of whatever you're creating in your brain, you're representing it. I would say distilling it. You're distilling it from me. That's an alchemical metaphor, right? You're taking the essence of what's in your brain. I mean, you're distilling the idea into this thing, and then I take that thing and kind of distill it, and I do the reverse process.
Right.
Feel free to interrupt, please.
In that metaphor, would sort of didactic writing be a sort of form of chemistry and poetry a form of alchemy, in which the actual goal of the exercise is different, even though they both are actually the same?
I think when Augustine leaves Greek oratory, Augustine says he's choser b'tshuva, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But Augustine was a Greek instructor, right? And he knew all the classics. And for Augustine, it meant, for him to become a real Christian meant to abandon chemistry for alchemy. He looked at the Greek use of language as being just pragmatic, and because totally pragmatic and worldly, decadent. So he believed that he had to devote himself entirely. You get a little idea of the monastic life of the Christian. From Augustine's perspective, you have to devote yourself entirely to the life of the holy, because everything else is decadent. There's no, if in using a Jewish reference, there's no Torah Umadah for Augustine. Augustine is all the way for revelation, and he just pushes off the Greek tradition. Like Ed is saying, I think chemistry is the pragmatic language, is pragmatism. You want a particular response, so you know what to activate. And poetry allows for different possibilities. It opens up possibilities, it doesn't close them.
Right. The chemistry works in signs, which are icons that can be understood by everyone to mean the same thing.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Metaphor works with symbols, which has have a multiplicity of meanings. What a candle means to you is not what a candle means to me.
Right. If it was as simple as you're saying, I would have done much better in chemistry in high school. But I understand what you're saying. But that's a nice metaphor. That really. It's the really what we've been talking about all year, which is the defense of poetry is a defense of a non-pragmatic language. Because pardon?
Just one more interjection, sorry. Because of St. Augustine and the Greeks that you brought up, and just to say that when Plato decides that Homeric religious poetry is beyond the pale, he obviously writes in a didactic way, but anyone who's read Plato in the original, I haven't, but anyone who's read it and I've spoken to says that Plato makes very sure that he outdoes Homer's poetry while doing it.
Exactly, right. There's so many, I've been reading, I don't know the Greek either, but when you leave an Ivy League college, like in the 80s, you think Plato was what Karl Popper says about him, that he was a fascist, right? Because you give the most simplistic reading of Plato. And that's how I taught it for the first, because I teach this introductory course, that's how I taught it for the first 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years. But the more you read him, the more you realize that whatever simple readings people want to hoist upon him are very, very hard to, you can't maintain them. There's just too much going on in his work. I actually felt today in writing about what we've been speaking about, that I started to understand Plato a little bit better. Remember, Plato makes a distinction between small letter B and the big letter B, beautiful. Beautiful, like there are the people who just see things and say, oh, that's beautiful, this is beautiful, beauty is in the sight of the beholder. But really, whatever. And then there's that abstract idea, the form of beauty. That's where all my colleagues and teachers in university go crazy. How can you believe in a form? How can you believe in the ideal? How can you believe in the absolute? How can you believe in the abstract? None of this makes sense. But what really Plato is suggesting, I think, is that what is beauty? Beauty is the ability to extrapolate out of all of those beautiful things that you've seen and to hypothesize a notion of that idea of beauty. You never see the form of beauty. You can't. It's not accessible. The only way you can see the beautiful with a capital B is through the beautiful with a lower b. Does the lower b beautiful encompass the bigger b beautiful? No, but it hints at it. It hints at it. And that's what, and the way I understand it is that that big B of beautiful is what's hinted at and never approached. But it's this, and I'm really reading Plato like a kind of midrashist, really, and going back to what Ed said, that's the big problem for all these people who want to say Plato is a fascist, is he writes like a poet. And if he writes like a poet, it means he's writing, going back to his metaphor, Ed's metaphor, not chemically, but alchemically. There's magic in Plato. Can we take a break here? We can decide whether we want to, let's take a break for a minute or two now. We can decide if we want to continue. I know it's almost 10 to 5. So I'm going to take a break for a second, and then we can come back and decide if we want to continue.
Hey, what are you doing next year?
Yes, me, Tikva?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm considering applying for the MA program.
Here?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I need to speak to Professor Kohlrenner.
Oh, be happy to see you around.
He's the MA advisor.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but we'll all be on Zoom.
I know.
Physical attendance.
Yeah. I'm kind of taking next semester off. I'm basically only doing Judaic studies classes. Give myself a break and then get back in spring semester next year.
It might be by next spring, might resume. I don't know for how long can you keep the students away from the classes?
I don't know. I mean, we need a vaccine. We need, there's so much that goes into keeping people safe in these kinds of circumstances.
I was going to apologize for the way we haven't gotten out of the same two passages, but people among you who are familiar with people who learn like Daf Yomi, they learn the Gemara every day. The Talmud is a very, very complicated and difficult document to learn. It's very long. Some people learn a daf a day, a page a day. So people who do that think that they understand the Talmud, right? And people who read Donne in an undergraduate class think they understand Donne. And you just see how long it takes to really understand something. We don't give ourselves the luxury of doing that often. That's what we should be doing in all of our graduate seminars. Really.
Think Daf Yomi?
But listen, Daf Yomi, it's just a different kind of learning. It's a familiarity, right? It's just different.
Very, very good for your Aramaic. Not so good for
understanding.
Okay,
I'm not saying they're not advantages. And Aramaic, and and who doesn't need Aramaic these days, right?
Well, if you're doing any research into
I got it. Yeah. Should we continue for a little while, or you want to call things quits for the day?
Well, I have.
You have to go. I know nobody has to apologize, right? I'm not going to feel bad.
So I'll see you.
See you. Bye, Alana. If you want to say goodbye, when I have to leave a Zoom meeting, I always say goodbye in the chat.
Okay.
It's kind of a cop-out, but that's what I do. Right. We're getting all these tips from the, we have to go to all these workshops for teaching. They keep on inviting us to these workshops. Like they bring in people from outside to teach us how to teach. I find it so offensive. I naturally do not go. I would go and lead a workshop in teaching, but I'm not going to go and like listen to professionals about teaching. Whatever. No, I'm sure there are good things about it. But no, that was a good hint, a good tip about leaving a Zoom meeting through chat. So you know what I'm gonna. So for me, I'd like to at least read the Newton, and I'll tell you why I'm reading Newton. And you know, if I'll break. You can leave anytime you want, and we can break again, and we won't go for more than a half hour without breaking. Now we were talking about the difference between the experience of God and the knowledge of God. The question I think becomes in the 17th century more of a question of, is there a God answered in spatial terms? Meaning, and I'm not really sure of this, and if I were to say this among scholars, they would start throwing things at me, because you're not allowed to have big stories anymore. That's a problem for you, Ed, is you're still like an old-time scholar. You're a big story person, and when you submit articles with big stories to scholarly journals, these academics who have very little else in their life start salivating, right? Because anybody who aspires to a big story is going to look like he's leaving something out, right? And you are leaving something out because you're telling a story, right? But that leaving out is like unthinkable. You can't leave it out. And this endless qualification of big stories, even though these big stories are very helpful. Because once you have them as a big story is like, well, you know, the birth of the individual in the Renaissance. A big story is what I'm just saying now, a transition from understanding the world in temporal terms to spatial terms. And what I'm suggesting is that language is by definition temporal, because language happens in time, speech happens in time, while understanding the world through space is immediate, much closer to Spinoza's mind to mind without mediation. I guess that's part of the issue of what sight is that giving us an unmediated relationship to the world.
What do you mean by the spatial one? I kind of got the
I'm thinking, we'll read this piece by Cudworth. That's dealing with, first of all, the distinction between, well, you know, mind and matter. Now, how do I answer that question? I look at matter, right? I look into space. I think that's visual, I think. I mean, I'm sure there are non-visual representations, but I think there is a sense in which, see, I had a colleague who, this is part of I really recommend Twitter. So I was tweeting about this, which of course, you know, who cares? But one of my colleagues cared. And I made this distinction between space and time. And my colleague said, you just did this like very, you know, I'm not so sure about this, right? Or saying, you know, I'm not terribly convinced by this, you know? You know what I'm talking about, Ed, right? And it's just like, it's ultimately so anti-intellectual because you're not allowed to say anything. You know, you have to like pull back every single time. So I'm going out there and I'm saying this, but I think there is a movement from understanding things temporally to spatially. I look at the world instead of telling stories about the world. That is the distinction that Donne made before. There is seeing the world. Oh, I believe there is a God. There is writing about the world. Oh, I know there is I can experience God. There are those two things. But what happens more and more is that latter form of knowledge goes by the wayside. That's really the story that these talks we've been having are going in that direction. That form of knowledge is no longer going to have currency. And what are you giggling about?
Just the idea that Twitter it's just such an incredible invention that even if you posit something as thought-provoking and interesting, it still creates some kind of fight.
No, it's usually much. There's other dynamics going on there. Twitter can be a very friendly place.
Good, I hope so.
Yeah. No, it's not. If you're on the Twitter for, you know, crazy polemicists is not for anybody. Anyway, right. So here in this figure, Now, why do I bring Ralph Cudworth? Cudworth is a group. Who cares about Ralph Cudworth? And the answer to that question is nobody. The reason nobody cares about Ralph Cudworth is he was in a group of theologian philosophers who were kind of, I would say, again, in a story that could be contested, but which is nonetheless useful, he was really between the culture of Donne and Milton and the culture of science, and really the culture of Descartes and Newton and what comes afterwards. That is, and there were a bunch of them, and they were called the Cambridge Platonists, which I always think would be a great name for an indie band, right? Great name for a band, but they are
Cambridge what?
Cambridge Platonists. Now, they were most concerned, really, in embracing every aspect of the scientific revolution because they understood the authority of people like Descartes. They saw that he was challenging rightfully all of their assumptions about knowledge, but they wanted to do that and maintain their theological commitments. So they're between those two cultures, Milton, Donne, knowledge, and then Milton and Donne, knowledge, language, experience, and that later culture, Descartes and Newton, sight, and just like not knowledge, not experience of the world, not the experience of God, but the knowledge that there is a God. So they're between those two places. Now, Cudworth writes this long book called The True Intellectual System of the Universe, which is this giant tome which collects all of the contemporary heresies, all of the contemporary heretical perspectives. It's like this, the reason I'm so interested in it is I kind of see it from a Freudian perspective of this obsessively anxious thing, right? This desire to not so much religious heresies, but philosophical heresies. Now, remember we talked about the two options that are available once you start accepting philosophical distinctions. You become either Hobbes, the materialist, or Spinoza, the pantheist, but very simply put. So Cudworth, he's living in that world, and half of the philosophical heresies are Spinozan, and the other half of the philosophical heresies are Hobbesian, right? And he wants to find a middle way. We talked about this the first time. Why is finding the middle way important? Is he wants to find a way of preserving the presence of God in the universe without suggesting that a God is identical with the universe, right? Remember the two options. One is, oh, the world is completely material. God is a separate thing. That's not satisfactory because God's not involved in the universe. Or the other side of the binary is, and this is Spinoza, the universe is God. They're identified. Both of those, as we said, were problematic for many reasons, theologically, politically, for all sorts of reasons. These are problematic perspectives. So there's a real need to try to solve the problem. So here is Cudworth's.
What's the problem if they're?
Problem is, how do you, if philosophers are right about the nature of reality, and there is a distinction between spirit and matter, or mind and body. Well, how does God maintain his presence in the world? Is God present in the world? Now, Milton would answer that question. How would he answer it? He would say, there is a paradise within thee, happier far. And you will see the world as a place in which God, I think the expression is, as is, or as if he is there. The paradise within thee, which makes you happier far, allows you to see God ki'ilu, as if he's present. You know God is present. I mean, it's not even ki'ilu. It's not magic. But for Milton, the emphasis is God becomes present through knowledge. I know God in a certain way. I understand God. I can read the world. For Cudworth and for all these Cartesians and everybody who comes afterwards, this knowledge of the world is not happening through language. It's happening through sight. It's happening in space. So once you give up that alchemical power of language, you're in trouble. So Cudworth comes up, his solution, and I think of it as a kind of metaphysical band-aid, because you'll see here that he's trying to have it both ways. What I mean by both ways is he wants to maintain the difference between the spiritual and the material world, but somehow claim their identity. Sounds a lot like metaphysical poetry, doesn't it? But the thing about Cudworth is he's a literalist about it. I'll read it here. Unless there be such a thing admitted as a plastic nature. Here's Cudworth's metaphysical band-aid. He's making this up. There's a plastic nature in the world that breeds for the sake of something, and in order to ends, regularly, artificially, and methodically, it seems that one or other of these two things must be concluded. So now he's saying, unless you believe in my idea of this plastic nature, then one or two of these two things must be concluded. That either in the formation and organization of the bodies of animals as well as other phenomenon, everything comes to pass fortuitously and happens to be as it is without the guidance and direction of any mind or understanding. That's one problem. That you'll believe that every phenomenon that happens in the universe happens without any guidance or direction of mind or understanding. It's a material universe, Hobbes, right? And Hobbes, and Cudworth doesn't even have to reject it. It self-evidently can't be the case. It can't be the case. Or, and here's the other side, that God himself doth all immediately, and as it were with his own hands, form the body of every gnat and fly, insect and mite. This also for Cudworth doesn't have to be rejected because it's too crazy to imagine. So Cudworth's plastic nature is this thing which he claims, it's like the Star Trek force field, which he says is simultaneously divine and of the material world, but not to be identified on this material world. One of the metaphors he uses is it's stamped on the material world. See why he likes that metaphor? Because its presence is through its absence. It's stamped on the world. So I mean, in a way, Cudworth is like Donne. He's a metaphysical poet. But he's being a metaphysical poet in a literal, physical sense. That with Milton and Donne, how do mind and body come together? Through the activity of reading or knowing, which is an activity, as we've said, right? It's an action. For once, and you really have to know much more about sight, or the physics of sight. Once sight becomes the primary criteria of truth, then it seems that you need something physical, and the plastic nature is both physical and metaphysical. You need something physical to hold these two worlds together. Why I call it like a metaphysical or philosophical band-aid is it's this tiny little plaster that you put on this gushing wound. It's so obviously, this is to me what's so interesting about these people, is not that their solutions are good, but that the solutions are so obviously poor. So it's kind of like the last crying out of poetry. It's the last crying out. I mean, I think, I'm not sure here whether Cudworth is being literal or poetic. I think he's really being literal using poetic terms. Ed, yeah, you want to say something?
I don't know Cudworth's writing at all. But
you're not the only one.
Yeah.
Most people don't. Yeah.
But it is very strange how he posits the argument with a kind of opening negative subclause. It's almost as if he's preemptively embarrassed by his conclusion.
Right. And as soon as he wrote this, there's this French dictionary, Bayle's dictionary in 1678, which is this philosophical dictionary, and Cudworth gets put in it as a heretic. Meaning the guy reads the philosophical, this true intellectual system and says, oh, you're in the Spinoza category. Because plastic nature doesn't make any sense. Once you're going to come up with this plastic nature thing, then you might as well be Spinoza, right?
Can you reiterate what does the plastic nature mean?
It really is just visualize it. It's like a Band-Aid, or it's you're trying to keep or it's not. It can't be a Band-Aid because it's not just adjacent, but somehow. Remember, I said there's that Cartesian joke of the pineal gland, that inside the brain there's the pineal gland, which is the place of the spirit in the body. This is Cudworth's version of that. It fails. I mean, he shares it with another Cambridge Platonist named Henry Moore, who was interestingly much older and was likely one of Milton's teachers. So Milton's involved in this whole movement. And Milton's response is very, very different than Moore and Cudworth. Moore is interesting in another way. Descartes gets published. Moore buys everything that Descartes' written, declares himself to be Cartesian, right? And then like a year or two later, he thinks about it and he says, well, I'm not that, right? Meaning he thought he could accommodate Descartes in his Christian worldview, but then he ends up spending the rest of his life arguing against Descartes. Just a cool time, right? I mean, they're taking things seriously. Meaning, you see, it's like, you know, more is it's not like they just ignore it.
No, but Professor, what I didn't get is how does he attempt to reconcile, to negotiate these two? Like you call it a band-aid, but what exactly is his logic?
I think he uses like Discordia Concords, that somehow this plastic nature, this magical force, is of the divine, and it stamps itself again on nature without becoming nature. Once it becomes nature, well, then it's a problem. Then nature is self-guiding, self-moving. Can't have that. You can't have matter moving by itself. Right? That's a problem. It's a scientific problem. It's also a major theological and philosophical problem, right? So he's like the intermediary between what I see is this older world of knowing through metaphor and knowing through sight. This movement from the temporal to the spatial.
Professor, does the plastic nature have to do with the essence plastic?
What?
No, is it? You know, there is like essence plastic that I don't remember. Let me look it up. No, it's something that Coleridge. No, it's much later, right now.
Right. Well, so it might be related in some sense through different traditions. Also
the use of the word, you can almost solve his problem. It almost the use of the word phenomena, and just thinking that not that long after, Kant just changes phenomena to noumena, and then you kind of you can sort of resolve. It creates another layer. The problem with describing, I just think there's a contradiction in the way Cudworth is looking at the reality of the world and then trying to work out.
I lost you between phenomena and noumena. What did you mean by that?
So the phenomena are the things that we can observe that happen, and therefore what's divine about them? Are they divine or not? If you put in a different category, as Kant does, which is the noumena, the things
go ahead.
Things that we cannot observe or know, but that we do know, that we know things. Human beings, rationality only goes so far, because human knowledge is actually capable of knowing things that cannot be known, and then applying it back to the world of phenomena. So we have
right, and that's
a bit like Plato's idea, sort of like Plato's forms, but taken one step further.
But it's not through metaphor for Kant. It's not through language. It's the pulling up short of language, isn't it?
Right. But I think by creating a different category of experience, which Cudworth isn't doing, he sort of expands the scope of the relationship between the knowable and the not knowable, and the divine and the mundane. It's almost like you can just add another category,
right,
by reading, and then you solve a bit of Cudworth's problem.
Right. That's why I see it as a kind of glue, like you're adding another thing into it. Right. Yeah, that was interesting. Let's just do one more passage, since I'm losing a little bit of my focus. I'm sure you are as well. Let's read a passage from Newton. Now, one of the things, like we were talking about the plastic nature, it's a way of mediating between the physical and the spiritual. Now, this is from Newton's Principia in 1687. And now we might add something concerning a certain most subtle spirit, which pervades and lies hid in all gross bodies. This does not sound like a scientist, does it? Right? All of a sudden, I'm in this world of subtle spirits. Newton inherits the same problem as Cudworth does. It's not that he doesn't care about it, he cares. And we talked before about Newton's idea of the temple in Jerusalem, the way in which the spiritual comes together in the Holy of Holies for him. Like, this is the most sacred place. His alchemical experiments, this idea to take out of the physical and see the spiritual in it. So Newton, as I was saying, is part of this older tradition, this older poetic tradition, which Cudworth literalizes. It's the tradition that goes back to Donne. Donne mediates, where he mediates between the physical and the spiritual with twin compasses. We see what Ed referred to as the noumenal, or the abstract, through those twin compasses. Things come together through language. Things come together because we see hidden resemblances between them. And here, I think Newton is participating in that spirit one more time. And now we might add something concerning a certain most subtle spirit which pervades and lies hidden in all gross bodies, by the force and action of which spirit, the particles of bodies mutually attract one another at near distances and cohere, if contiguous, and electric bodies operate to greater distances, as well as repelling as attracting the neighboring corpuscles. And light is emitted, reflected. Corpuscle? I think it's an older, like a physical term for cells, or what's a corpuscle? Embarrassed humanist.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll just look it up later.
Yeah, and light is emitted, reflected, inflected, and heats bodies, and all sensation is excited. And the members of animal bodies move at the command of the will, namely by vibrations of the spirit, mutually propagated along the solid filaments of the nerves, from the outward organs of sense to the brain, and from the brain into the muscles. But these are the things that cannot be explained in few words, nor are we furnished with that sufficiency of experiments which is required to an accurate determination and demonstration of the laws by which this electric and elastic spirit operates. Now, I know we're not scientists, and if you think that I understood this any more than you did in terms of what Newton is trying to express, I don't know. I'm not a physicist, but I am paying attention to the metaphors that Newton uses here. And through the metaphors that Newton uses here, it does seem that he's part of this other world in which he's trying to make spirit and body come together. He hasn't gotten the alchemy out of his system. He's still dealing with that problem. It's on his mind. It's on the mind of everybody during this period. And now eventually, he grows out of this perspective. And in 1718, when he writes the Optics, and we'll finish with these two passages, you can see Newton dealing with this even more specifically. God is everywhere present, and who is able by his will to move all bodies in his infinite sensorium. What is that? And thus form and reform all parts of the entire universe according to his choice, by a much greater degree than our soul, which is the image of God in us, is able to move the members of the body by its will. Let's read one more thing where Newton talks again about this. Does it not appear from phenomena that there is a being incorporeal? Now, on the one hand, Newton is writing scientifically and philosophically. On the other hand, he's dealing with the same questions that Donne is dealing with, but in a very different way. Does it not appear from phenomenon that there is a being incorporeal, living, intelligent, omnipresent, who in infinite space, see space here, and people like More, and Newton read a lot of More because More was also a philosopher. There was a very big interest in the idea of infinite space. Is there such a thing as infinite space? Oh, you can see why they might care about that, right? It's a hard thing to answer. Who in infinite space, as it were in his sensory, sees the things themselves intimately, and thoroughly perceives them and comprehends them wholly by their immediate presence to himself. of which the image is only carried through the organs of sense into our little sensoriums, are there seen and beheld by that which in us perceives and thinks. I know it's arcane language, but again, Newton is dealing with the same problem. How does he deal? And everybody loves this solution. This is like the answer that everybody's been waiting for. And one of the reasons Newton is called the divine Newton. How does he address it? How does he address the relationship between the infinite and the physical? How is God, and this is what he's really trying to negotiate in this second passage, how is God present to the physical world? Now, Cudworth here is interesting as a kind of a touchstone, because for Cudworth, it happens, there's some kind of semi-physical interaction between spirit and body. How does Newton understand it? Let's read it again together. He says there's an infinite being incorporeal, who in infinite space, as we're in his sensory. So God has something called his sensory. He's going to call this thing called the sensorium. The sensorium people would have known because it's referred to, a medieval way of referring to the inside of the brain, the part of the mind that senses the physical, kind of the medieval way of solving that problem on a human level. But he says this of God. In his sensory, sees the things themselves intimately and thoroughly perceives them. Well, he's really hitting it in the nail here. Excuse me. Sees them intimately, thoroughly perceives them, and comprehends them wholly by their immediate presence to himself. Just like us, like we see images in our sensorium. So how does he solve the problem? And why is this satisfactory? Why is Newton heralded as the bastion of scientific orthodoxy, of science that is going to provide the foundation for political orthodoxy, theological orthodoxy? Like, we were worried for a while. We're going to be either stuck with Hobbes, materialism, atheism, bad, or Spinoza, pantheism, republicanism, revolution, also bad. We need to fix it. So Newton to the rescue, right? How does he pull it off? What do people like about this? I mean, here Newton is, you see the emphasis on immediate, unmediated knowledge.
Is he effectively synthesizing the experiential and the divine? I'd like to see I mean, this would be very interesting as a diagram, right?
I looked. Do you want to see a diagram, right? Okay.
Well, because it's like there's like a Venn diagram of the experiential,
right,
and the rational. What he's done is he's just sort of forget about the crossover. Let's just put one over the other. So we're just like hundreds of little tiny sensoriums inside the big sensorium. It's like everything gets incorporated. It's odd. I'm from my point of view, it's not that convincing. So it's interesting to hear why it was so popular as a resolution.
So I would, what you described sounds like Leibniz. So I mean, what's interesting here is that you have these major figures who are trying to come up with the right metaphors. Leibniz, which we'll look at next time, he's got this idea, it's like a Star Trek episode. He calls it of monads. They were all like monads in this, and we're all cut off from everybody. And we exist entirely independently. We don't interact with anybody or anything. And it's strange that Leibniz this is not for him a source of existential angst. He's like the most cheerful Christian you can possibly imagine. He's the one in Voltaire's Candide who is mocked over and over because Leibniz says that God creates the best possible world. And no, really? Is this the best possible world? But we'll come back to Leibniz, we'll save for next time. But Newton is emphasizing sight and space. So what he's doing here, and perception, God becomes part of the world through perceiving it, through seeing it. But God's knowledge is not like the knowledge that we talked about through metaphor. God's knowledge here is immediate knowledge. He is somehow present to the world through perceiving it.
So God's only involvement is perceiving?
Pardon?
So God's only involvement is perceiving?
Exactly, right. It's like, and if you have questions on that, right, it's like Ed said, I hear in your voice kind of skepticism. And yeah, I understand. That's Ed saying I'm not really convinced by it. But the solution is elegant for them because it allows God to be present without being part. So I think the elegance of the solution, or the utilitarian elegance of the solution was what becomes so compelling. It fits everything. It makes, as I think you said, somebody said last time, it allows for hierarchical politics. It allows for that, or Tikva said that last time. It allows for hierarchical politics, and it also allows for a hierarchical church, and that it also, while saying that God is somehow still part of the world, present to the world. Now, there were other objections to this, and this will end today, that Leibniz, in 1735, I think, or earlier than that, 1718 or sometime like that, maybe I'll tell you the date next time. Leibniz gets onto this, and he basically, he writes, you can see him just going crazy about this. He hates this idea. There may have been the jealousy between the two people who discovered calculus at the same time. But his question is to Newton, it's an interesting way that he approaches it. He says, are you saying that God actually has organs of sensation? He's like an extreme puritanical Maimonidean, meaning how can you say that God has organs of perception? And one of the things that's interesting that we'll start with really next time is Newton himself is not involved in this debate, or he is, but only as advisor to the churchman, Samuel Clarke, who was also obviously knew what he was talking about in scientific terms, is writing against Leibniz. So they're having this back and forth, and Clarke says to Leibniz, it's a metaphor. And each time Leibniz comes back and says, well, how can you say God has a body? And Clarke keeps on repeating, it's a metaphor. And I kind of see in that statement of Clarke, that repetition of it's a metaphor, it's like the last crying out of that older culture in which we know the world through metaphor and language, in which we acknowledge the way in which metaphor produces the world in time through stories, and against that new way of knowing, which is seeing the world immediately in space. That's what has authority. And that's what, I think that's what really triumphs. And when we see the end of, when we see language or poetry taking a back seat, I think part of it is because, and I think the major part of it is because of that metaphor has a temporal aspect. And time, I mean, of course, that temporal aspect is associated with beginnings and middles and ends and fictions. So it's easy to push off the temporal aspect of narrative, and to embrace this truth that even we experience as immediate, right? I see this thing, right? Whatever it is, I see it. I don't need to tell a story about it. I see it. I know what it is. It's like what Donne says at the beginning. I know there is a God, but how do you experience God? You experience God through reading, I mean, how do you experience God? You experience God through being a part of, reading, being a part of, taking the initiative. That's why the scientific perspective is so dangerous to religious belief, because it tells you that in order to know, you don't really need to make an effort. Of course, you have to have the right scientific experiments, but the world is just there. Just look at it. I mean, much of Francis Bacon's early arguments about methodology are basically him screaming at the top of his lungs. Will you just look at what's there? Look at what's there. Look at it. See it. Meaning, stop telling stories about, spheres and hierarchies and chains of being. Those are very nice for poets, but they don't actually do anything. While other poets, Milton, Donne, Shakespeare, are using those poetic tropes as ways of discovering, inventing the world. Because for them, reading, knowledge is in activity. Is that right to say that sight is? Am I diminishing the proactive nature of sight? You hear what I'm asking you? Am I creating a straw target out of sight?
But the poet also sees.
What do you mean?
He makes up stuff that he bases on things that he has seen, and and then he creates new. I don't know. Just forget.
I'm glad after 3 years in the Barryland English department, you refer to the poet as making up stuff. No, so right. No, obviously there is this process of sight. I mean, Milton talks about sight and internal sight, but there's also that process of translation, right? Of translating that sight, whether internal or external, into language. That's the activity. I mean, I'm not even sure that those two things are different. The invention and the seeing. There's a psychoanalyst who talks about how the dream only really comes into being with its interpretation. And you could say that about perception in general, that the perception only happens, that the experience is waiting for the perception in order for it to become, as it were, real.
That's what they do. There is something called a tavat chalom when somebody has a bad dream.
Mm.
So the rabbinical belief is that only when he goes to somebody to interpret it, then when it acquires meaning.
Right. Right. And there are different interpretations, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever. There are a lot of there's a lot of interesting things, but that's interesting, yeah.
But I'm finding it a very difficult passage. It's not entirely not Cartesian, right? Because he's sort of saying we perceive God because God perceives everything, and therefore God must perceive himself. So it's a sort of God cogito ergo sum.
Well, not only himself, God isn't only seeing himself, he's also seeing the world.
Right, but as the world is encapsulated within his sensory, the most important first element is that God exists because God perceives himself, which is is quite Cartesian in the sense. It becomes quite circular.
Where do you see that God exists because he perceives himself?
Because if he's omnipresent and in infinite space, but that is inside his own sensory apparatus.
He's really having, someone is really having his cake and eating it too. That's what Ed is saying, right? He's omnipresent, but which does suggest this Cartesian spatial model, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in the sense that, yeah, sort of. But the idea that the way that it's Cartesian in the sense that we exist because we perceive ourselves, and therefore God exists because he perceives us and himself. What makes God great is that he can perceive everything and himself, and he is himself everything. But to me, it's almost tautologous. It kind of goes around in circles.
I mean, saying that he is everywhere does sound very. It sounds like something that you might expect in Spinoza, right? But he's clearly not going there. I was thinking, I'm trying to understand what you were saying, or going back, and that's a corrective to what I was saying about Clarke saying about Newton to Leibniz, it's only a metaphor.
Yeah, I haven't got to Leibniz yet, but I'm feeling a few problems that I'm sure. I mean, the jump from incorporeal to his sensory. So he goes from something, he doesn't say in his senses or in his, he actually turns it into a physical object, that God has a sensory.
There you go.
And yet he's also simultaneously incorporeal.
Right,
he's living
again. So he has sensorium, or he's incorporeal?
Well, yeah, slow down. We need you to put on we need your best pedagogical mode here, so we can all at 5:30 understand what you're saying. So you have a lot of responsibility on you.
He has no physical form. He's incorporeal, and yet he perceives everything inside something that has form, which is something called a sensory. He doesn't use an adjective for his own perception. He uses a physical form on purpose. Obviously, but it's an odd contradiction. Because what is this thing called the sensory? What is it physically made up?
What is the contradiction again?
It's the use of the language to me. In his sensory means it's something that God possesses physically, and yet at the same time he's incorporeal and omnipresent.
Yeah, okay. He's having his cake and eating it too, right? He is having his cake and eating it too. So just as a coming attraction, we'll do Leibniz next time. Is Leibniz, he can't deal with any of this. No vibrations, no gases, no electricity, no plastic this. Leibniz accuses Newton of being cut with. He actually accuses Newton of being like Henry Moore. I mean, you're just a Cambridge Platonist. You're no better than they are. Because Leibniz, again, has this puritanical aspect of there can't be anything in the world. Spirit can't manifest itself in any way, in any kind of, smoky, lost. Remember the monster in Lost, like the smoky kind of thing that permeates everything, right? You can't have any of that. So Leibniz has to clean up the universe, and this is in the book which he calls Theodicy, which can bring us back to a beginning. Leibniz Milton writes, or people have been writing Theodicies for generations, for centuries, but Leibniz is the first he comes up with that term, Theodicy, justifying the ways of God to man, and then he writes a book called Theodicy. And one of the questions that you have to ask in relationship to him is, well, how does he justify the ways of God to man if God's never present to the world? Because he can't be. Anyway, that will be for next time. I guess I wanted to focus on Newton. Because I see him as part of this poetic tradition. I hear the questions that you have in relationship to the metaphor that he uses. But I'm just thinking that when Clarke says it's only a metaphor, there's still that understanding that metaphor provides a way of understanding the world independent of sight. And I think that's what finally goes away. And when we talk about the death of poetry, it's poetry as this temporal medium. Metaphor is a temporal medium. Metaphor itself is translatio, carrying over from one realm to another. So that activity takes place in time. And any rendering of any metaphor always implies, I think, some kind of temporal aspect. But once space takes priority, then metaphor gets pushed to the side. As we turn the clock into September, believe it or not, that's happening. Do we still want to try to get together? Yeah? Okay, well, thank you again for carrying me through this talk, or this conversation better. I'm very grateful. And please, if anybody, this medium, as much as I think we've mastered it as a group, it doesn't allow for the communication that happens through body movement. I mean, I can see when he lies down. It's usually like a signal that we should probably end. I used to go to a synagogue where the rabbi, where different people would give the drashot, and when the very elderly rabbi, when he put his hat back on, that was the symbol that the other person better stop talking. So that's kind of how that's how I see the.
Look! I'm not lying down. I'm erect. I'm vertical.
You're vertical. Okay. Anyway, so if anybody has any comments or further conversations, please write me and we can talk. Let's arrange to talk some other time, since I'm a little wiped out right now. Maybe we'll talk. It's Friday. We'll write to me and we'll make an arrangement. Okay.
Okay. Can you just add me to the people to the list of the.
Yes, I will do that. I will do that. Yes.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, all right. I will do that also. Sorry, Ronnie. I will do that. Okay. Great, people. Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.